Chapter 4. By the light of the lamp, Abner sat down to the kitchen table after he had had a small repast, and opened Luther Wadley's ledger. The opening pages had been torn out, but from an examination of the fragments of sheets still attached to the threads of the sewing, Abner concluded that these pages were purely of accounts, as if his grandfather had taken up an old, not completely used account book for a purpose other than keeping accounts, and had removed such sheets as had been more prosaically utilized. From the beginning, the entries were cryptic. They were undated, except for the day of the week. This Saturday, Ariah answered my inquiry. S. was seen 7 times with Ralsa Marsh, Obed's great-grandson, swam together by night. Such was the first entry, clearly pertaining to Aunt Sary's visit to Innsmouth, about which grandfather had plainly inquired of Ariah. Something had impelled Luther to make such an inquiry. From what he knew of his grandfather's character, Abner concluded that the inquiry had been made after Sary had returned to Danwich. Why? The next entry was pasted in, and was clearly part of a typewritten letter received by Luther Wadley. Ralsa Marsh is probably the most repellent of all the family. He is almost degenerate in his looks. I know you have said that it was Libby of your daughters who was the fairest. Even so, we cannot imagine how Sarah came to take up with someone who is so repulsive as Ralsa, in whom all those recessive characteristics which have been seen in the Marsh family after Obed's strange marriage to that Polynesian woman. The Marshes have denied that Obed's wife was Polynesian, but of course he was trading there at that time, and I don't credit those stories about that uncharted island where he was supposed to have dallied, seem to have come to fullest fruit. As far as I can now ascertain, after all, it is over 2 months, close to 4, I think, since her return to Dunwich. They were constantly together. I am surprised that Ariah did not inform you of this. None of us here had any mandate to halt Sarah's seeing Ralsa, and, after all, they are cousins, and she was visiting at Marsh's, not here. Abner judged that this letter had been written by a woman, also a cousin, who bore Luther some resentment for Sarah's not having been sent to stay with her branch of the family. Luther had evidently made inquiry of her regarding Ralsa. The third entry was once again in Luther's hand, summarizing a letter from Ariah. Saturday. Ariah maintains Deep Ones a sect or quasi-religious group. Subhuman. Said to live in the sea and worship Dagon, another god named Cthulhu. Guild people, resembling frogs or toads more than fish, but eyes ichthic. Claims Obed's late wife was one. Holds that Obed's children all bore the marks. Marsh's guild? How else could they swim 1.5 miles to Devil Reef and back? Marshes eat sparingly, can go without food and drink a long time, diminish or expand in size rapidly. To this Luther had appended 4 scornful exclamation marks. Zadok Allen swears he saw Sarah swimming out to Devil Reef, Marshes carrying her along, all naked. Swears he saw Marshes with tough, warty skin, some with scales, like fish. Swears he saw them chase and eat fish, tear them apart like animals. The next entry was again a portion of a letter, patiently a reply to one from Grandfather Wadley. You ask who is responsible for those ridiculous tales about the Marshes. Well, Luther, it would be impossible to single out any 1 or a dozen people over several generations. I agree that Zadok Allen talks too much, drinks, and may be romancing, but he is only one. The fact is, this legendary, or rigmarole as you call it, has grown up from one generation to the next, through 3 generations. You have only to look at some of the descendants of Captain Obed to understand why this could have come about. There are some Marsh offspring said to have been too horrible to look upon. Old wives' tales? Well, Dr. Rowley Marsh was too ill to attend one of the Marsh women one time, so they had to call Dr. Gilman, and Gilman always said that what he delivered was less than human, and nobody ever saw that particular marsh, though there were people later who claimed to have seen things moving on 2 legs that weren't human. Following this, there was a brief but revealing entry in 2 words. Punished Sarah. This must then mark the date of Sarah Wadley's confinement to the room above the mill. For some time after this entry, there was no mention of his daughter in Luther's script. Instead, his jottings were not dated in any way, and, judging by the difference in the color of the ink, were made at different times, though run together. Many frogs seemed to bear in on the mill, seemed to be more than in the marshes across the Miskatonic. Sleeping difficult. Are whippoorwills on the increase too, or is this imagination? Counted 37 frogs at the porch steps tonight. There were more entries of this nature. Abner read them all, but there was no clue in them to what the old man had been getting at. Luther Wadley had thereafter kept book on frogs, fog, fish, and their movements in the Miskatonic, when they rose and leapt from the water, and so on. This seemed to be unrelated data, and was not in any way connected to the problem of Sarah. There was another hiatus after this series of notes, and then came a single underscored entry. Araya was right. But about what had Araya been right? Abner wondered. And how had Luther Wadley learned that Araya had been right? There was no evidence that Araya and Luther had continued their correspondence, or even that Araya desired to write to the crotchety Luther without a letter of direct inquiry from Luther. There followed a section of the record to which newspaper clippings had been pasted. These were clearly unrelated, but they did establish for Abner the fact that somewhat better than a year had passed before Luther's next entry, one of the most puzzling Abner found. Indeed, the time hiatus seemed to be closer to 2 years. R out again. If Luther and Sarah were the only people in the house, who was R? Could it have been Ralsa Marsh come to visit? Abner doubted it, for there was nothing to show that Ralsa Marsh harbored any affection for his distant cousin, or certainly he would have pursued her before this. The next notation seemed to be unrelated. 2 turtles, 1 dog, remains of a woodchuck. Bishop's 2 cows, found on the Miskatonic end of the pasture. A little further along, Luther had set down further such data. After 1 month, a total of 17 cattle, 6 sheep. Hideous alterations. Size commensurate with amount of food. Z over. Anxious about talk going around. Could Z stand for Zebulon? Abner thought it did. Evidently then Zebulon had come in vain, for he had left him, Abner, with only vague and uncertain hints about the situation at the house when Aunt Sari was confined to the shuttered room. Zebulon, on the evidence of such conversation as he had shared with Abner, knew less than Abner himself did after reading his grandfather's record. But he did know of Luther's record, so Luther must have told him he had set down certain facts. These notations, however, were more in the nature of notes for something to be completed later. They were unaccountably cryptic, unless one had the key of basic knowledge which belonged to Luther Wadley. But in a growing sense of urgency was clearly manifest in the old man's further entries. Ada Wilkerson gone. Trace of scuffle. Strong feeling in Dunwich. John Sawyer shook his fist at me, safely across the street where I couldn't reach him. Monday. Howard Willie this time. They found 1 shoe, with the foot still in it. The record was now near its end. Many pages, unfortunately, had been detached from it, some with violence, but no clue remained as to why this violence had been done to Grandfather Wadley's account. It could not have been done by anyone but Luther himself. Perhaps, thought Abner, Luther felt he had told too much, and intended to destroy anything which might put a later reader on the track of the true facts regarding Aunt Sari's confinement for the rest of her life. he had certainly succeeded. The next entry once again referred to the elusive R. R, back at last. Then, nailed the shutters to the windows of Sarah's room. And at last, once he has lost weight, he must be kept on a careful diet and to a controllable size. In a way, this was the most enigmatic entry of them all. Was he also R? If so, why must he be kept on a careful diet? And what did Luther Whately mean by controlling his size? There was no ready answer to these questions in such material as Abner had read thus far, either in this record, or the fragmentary accounts still left in the record, or in letters previously perused. He pushed away the record book, resisting an impulse to burn it. He was exasperated, all the more so because he was uneasily aware of an urgent need to learn the secret embalmed within this old building. The hour was now late. Darkness had fallen some time ago, and the ever-present clamor of the frogs and the whippoorwills had begun once more, rising all around the house. Pushing from his thoughts briefly the apparently unconnected jottings he had been reading, he called from his memory the superstitions of the family, representing those prevalent in the countryside, associating frogs and the calling of whippoorwills and owls with death, and from this meditation progressed readily to the amphibian link which presented itself. The presence of frogs brought before his mind's eye a grotesque caricature of one of the Marsh clan of Innsmouth, as described in the letters Luther Whately had saved for so many years. Oddly, this very thought, for all that it was so casual, startled him. The insistence of frogs and toads on singing and calling in the vicinity was truly remarkable. Yet, batrachia had always been plentiful in the Dunwich vicinity, and he had no way of knowing for how long a period before his arrival they had been calling about the old Whately house. He discounted the suggestion that his arrival had anything at all to do with it. More than likely, the proximity of the Miskatonic and a low, swampy area immediately across the river on the edge of Dunwich accounted for the presence of so many frogs. His exasperation faded away. His concern about the frogs did likewise. He was weary. He got up and put the record left by Luther Whately carefully into one of his bags, intending to carry it away with him, and to puzzle over it until some sort of meaning came out of it. Somewhere there must exist a clue. If certain horrible events had taken place in the vicinity, something more in the way of a record must exist than Luther Whately's spare notes. It would do no good to inquire of Dunwich people. Abner knew that they would maintain a close-mouthed silence before an outsider like himself, for all that he was related to many of them. It was then that he thought of the stacks of newspapers, still set aside to be burned. Despite his weariness, he began to go through packs of the Aylesbury Transcript, which carried, from time to time, a Dunwich department. After an hour's hasty search, he found 3 vague articles, none of them in the regular Dunwich columns, which corroborated entries in Luther Whately's ledger. The first appeared under the heading, Wild Animal Slays Stock Near Dunwich. Several cows and sheep have been slain on farms just outside Dunwich by what appears to be a wild animal of some kind. Traces left at the scenes of the slaughter suggest some large beast, but Professor Bethnal of Miskatonic's University Anthropology Department points out that it is not inconceivable that packs of wolves could lurk in the wild hill country around Dunwich. No beast of the size suggested by the traces reported was ever known to inhabit the eastern seaboard within the memory of man. County officials are investigating. Search as he might, Abner could find no follow-up story. He did, however, come upon the story of Ada Wilkerson. A window lady, Ada Wilkerson, 57, living along the Miskatonic out of Dunwich, may have been the victim of foul play 3 nights ago. When she failed to visit a friend by appointment in Dunwich, her home was visited. No trace of her was found. However, the door of her house had been broken in, and the furniture had been wildly thrown about, as if a violent struggle had taken place. A very strong musk is said to have pervaded the entire area. Up to press time today, Mrs. Wilkerson has not been heard from. 2 subsequent paragraphs reported briefly that authorities had not found any clue to Mrs. Wilkerson's disappearance. The account of a large animal was resurrected lamely, and Professor Bethnal's beliefs on the possible existence of a wolf pack, but nothing further, for investigation had disclosed that the missing lady had neither money nor enemies, and no one would have any motive for killing her. Finally, there was the account of Howard Willie's death, headed, "Shocking Crime at Dunwich." Sometime during the night of the 21st, Howard Willie, 37, a native of Dunwich, was brutally slain as he was on his way home from a fishing trip along the upper reaches of the Miskatonic. Mr. Willie was attacked about half a mile past the Luther Wadley property, as he walked through an Auerbird Lane. He evidently put up a fierce fight, for the ground is badly torn up in all directions. The poor fellow was overcome, and must have been literally torn limb from limb, for the only physical remains of the victim consisted of his right foot, still encased in its shoe. It had evidently been cruelly torn from his leg by great force. Our correspondent in Dunwich advises us that people there are very sullen and in a great rage of anger and fear. They suspect many of their number of being at least partly to blame, though they stoutly deny that anyone in Dunwich murdered either Willie or Mrs. Wilkerson, who disappeared a fortnight ago, and of whom no word has since been heard. The account concluded with some data about Willie's family connections. Thereafter, subsequent editions of the transcript were distinguished only for the lack of information about the events which had taken place in Dunwich, where authorities and reporters alike apparently ran up against blank walls in the stolid refusal of the natives to talk or even speculate about what had happened. There was, however, one insistent note which recurred in the comments of investigators, relayed to the press, and that was such trail or track as could be seen appeared to have disappeared into the waters of the Miskatonic, suggesting that if an animal were responsible for the orgy of slaughter which had occurred at Dunwich, it may have come from and returned to the river. Though it was now close to midnight, Abner massed the discarded newspapers together and took them out to the riverbank, where he set them on fire, having saved only torn pages relative to the occurrences at Dunwich. The air being still, he did not feel obliged to watch the fire, since he had already burned a considerable area, and the grass was not likely to catch on fire. As he started away, he heard suddenly above the ululation of the whippoorwills and frogs, now at the frenzied crescendo, the tearing and breaking sound of wood. He thought at once of the window of the shuttered room, and retraced his steps. In the very dim light flickering towards the house from the burning newspapers, it seemed to Abner that the window gaped wider than before. Could it be that the entire mill part of the house was about to collapse? Then, out of a corner of his eye, he caught sight of a singularly formless moving shadow just beyond the mill wheel, and a moment later he heard a churning sound in the water. The voices of the frogs had now risen to such a volume that he could hear nothing more. He was inclined to dismiss the shadow as the creation of the wild flames leaping upward from the fire. The sound in the water might well have been that of the movement made by a school of fish darting forward in concert. Nevertheless, he thought, it would do no harm to have another look at Aunt Sary's room. He returned to the kitchen, took the lamp, and mounted the stairs. He unlocked the door of the shuttered room, threw open the door, and was almost felled by the powerful musk which pushed hallward. The smell of the Miskatonic, of the marshes, the odor of that slimy deposit left on the stones and sunken debris when the Miskatonic receded to its low water stage, the cloying pungence of some animal lairs, all these were combined in the shuttered room. Abner stood for a moment, wavering on the threshold. True, the odor in the room could have come in through the open window. He raised the lamp so that more of its light fell upon the wall above the mill wheel. Even from where he stood it was possible to see that not only was all the window itself now gone, but so was the frame, Even at this distance it was manifest that the frame had been broken out from inside. He fell back, slammed the door shut, locked it, and fled downstairs with the shell of his rationalizations tumbling about him.